Maimane and Herman Mashaba are holding a press conference together with Ugandan opposition leader Bobi Wine, and they're hoping to talk about challenges facing opposition parties in South Africa and freedom. Let's cross there now live.
In fact, this continent has fought off a number of dictators in different forms and formats. We've been through a wave of liberation, both from colonialism and, in this particular, in South Africa, apartheid. And throughout all that time, you discover very quickly that at first you must be liberated, and then soon after that you must liberate yourself from the liberators. Africa as a continent faces an interesting challenge, not only one of population growth, but also how that population growth will mean for things like migration and the delivery of services and economic growth. And it's within that context that I think it becomes important that we build governments all across the continent that are able to not only be agile enough to respond to a changing climate and a changing context, but also to be able to fight harder to deliver for citizens. We both love this continent. That's what got us together. I'm young. He'll tell you his own age. No. But we both brought together kindredly because we believe the future of this continent is a generational change, and we need to bring that change. And it is my passion, as I've been working with leaders in opposition parties, certainly in SADC, to also be able to meet with leaders in the rest of the continent. And we're committed to a journey of where we fight for democratic values, to ensure that dictators do not get to determine what happens in this continent, but furthermore that we fight for the next generation of Africans, that in this continent we can retain the skills, we can ensure that we deliver services and bring the change in this continent that this continent desperately needs. And so, in that light, it was a great honor to meet you, sir. And I certainly look forward, looking forward to further engagements and a program where all across as African young leaders can be able to charter a course for the future.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, my brother Mmusi. It has been an absolute honor to meet my brother Mmusi, a young man that I've been watching from a distance and admiring. As young Africans, most importantly, we share similar challenges. They might differ a little bit. Our challenges, our struggles might differ a little bit in a context that probably South Africa is a little bit ahead of the rest of Africa. However, the undeniable values of democracy and good governance drag us more together. And in this historical moment where the future of Africa is being determined, where our activities now, where our beliefs now, where our aspirations now are going to be responsible in the determination of the Africa that we want to live in, we see it important to interlink, to communicate, to be one, to share each other's plight. Like it was said by our elders many years ago that Africa can't be free unless all of Africa is free. And we also noticed that our solutions, much as they are influenced a great deal by our friends outside the continent, we indeed, as young leaders of the continent, are the solution. So in that regard, I'm very happy to connect with my brother Mmusi and to know that as young people of Africa, we shall continue the conversation, sharing ideas, sharing conversations, sharing aspirations, and learning from each other to see that indeed we are able to paint the right picture of the Africa that we want to grow old in, and the Africa that we want to hand over to our posterity. So I thank you for having us, and we thank you for being with us today, ladies and gentlemen.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Anita from Voice of America. 3 quickies. First of all, are you too optimistic about the state of opposition movements across the continent? I know it's a mixed bag. Mmusi, if you can maybe talk a little bit about your Zambia experience. But let's also note that the new head of state in Congo is an opposition leader. Then I just wanted to ask about how your campaign's been going, Bobi, and also what advice Mmusi has given you as somebody who's run for the presidency. And then finally, when you said the future is, I nearly filled it in with the future is female, and then I realized I can't think of a lot of opposition leaders across the continent who are women. What are you two doing for your sisters with you? Because there don't seem to be a lot of them.
Sure. I mean, firstly, let me start with the last question first, and then I'll work my way backwards. And then, on the starting point, the point you make about opposition leaders being predominantly male in this particular continent is a genuine concern. I certainly, for one, having interacted even in Zimbabwe, I know from a parliamentary process there, we met with a number of female leaders. And I think part of the inherent danger that some of the issues in Africa are bringing on board requires that we need to be much more stronger and much more determined at making sure that our female counterparts enjoy the protection of their rights as anybody else. It requires that even in the pipeline of development of leaders, you ensure that young women are able to not only start school but finish school but get through it and be. And ultimately, I think that it's something that, as we build coalitions all across Africa, that we've got to be deliberate about it. And so part of our engagement will be over a period of time to say how can we ensure that female leaders are coming on board. I know it's a challenge all over the continent. The face of poverty is fundamentally female in this continent. And I certainly am of the firm view that whatever structures and processes that we put on the table must be attractive and must ensure that more females can participate in it. And certainly when I have been working with the South African Partnership for Democratic Change, that was always the question on the table. As I'm meeting leaders in Tanzania, we know very clearly Tanzania, Angola, Zimbabwe, Zambia, this question is certainly one that requires for more activism and more work to be able to bring them on board. I was in Botswana meeting their leadership there, and it's certainly a question that in the new coalition there, I've insisted on asking them to say, hey, whatever you do here, you need to bring on more female leaders and make it possible for female leaders to participate. I think working to the state of opposition is a reflection of the state of government equally so. I think African governments in certain instances are becoming more and more dangerous. Bobi will tell you himself, the incarcerations that are taking place of opposition leaders, the violence that is taking place is a deep concern. We're finding that it cannot be that you live in a continent where the leader of opposition in Tanzania is shot just for standing up for something. It cannot be that when you go to Zimbabwe, that in fact members of parliament from the opposition are being kicked out of their country, and we have this sort of pseudo celebration of Mnangagwa. Yet in fact, when you look at the atrocities that are taking place and the state of governance, we have to be deeply concerned. It's not that when I look at the leader of opposition in Malawi, in Lazarus, they are embroiled in a court case right now, disputing the legitimacy of the election results. So I think we're undergoing massive change in Africa. We're undergoing a transition where those who have been used to the perks of power and been able to have the rule of man are learning that what we want to bring in Africa is the rule of law. And therefore, when I look at the state of opposition, at least in the SADC region, there are parts of me that is concerned about the predatory nature of some of the dictatorial tendencies that are occurring among some of our leaders, which makes it harder to be in opposition. I think South Africa, in many ways, we've enjoyed the privilege of being able to be in an open, contested, democratic space, but more must be done. We must be able to ensure that we bring democratic change. Otherwise, you'll think liberators must rule in perpetuity and for eternity. So certainly, I think we need better partnerships, better coordination, and better support. One of the things that I think as opposition leaders we failed at doing, if I'm willing, is that we haven't always coordinated enough. So you end up with HH in Zambia ending up in jail, and Edgar Lungu acting in manners that are outside parliamentary work, and there isn't sufficient support. You end up in a situation, as Bobi Wine will tell you in a moment, that the atrocities that have been taking place in Uganda, where their concerts have been, banned, all of that sort of stuff is taking place. You cannot be living in a continent where there's an oppression of opposition in the level that it is. So I certainly think that there needs to be better coordination amongst opposition leaders, better funding for opposition politics, and that we ultimately ensure that there's a media presence that's willing to say, we will talk to the opposition in the same way as we'll speak to some of these governments, and we must work towards bringing that change.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'll elaborate a little bit more about our political situation in Uganda, especially as regards our desire for democracy. Uganda, in my opinion, is a highlight of the picture on many parts of the African continent, especially those places that are not free. It has been mentioned that in Uganda today I am an artist who cannot be allowed to practice his profession. More than 157 concerts of mine have been cancelled. I cannot be allowed to engage, to interact freely with the public. I'm a member of parliament who cannot be allowed to address his constituents, and indeed more than once churches have been tear gassed when we go there to join the congregation. But again, like my brother just said, Africa is on a very speedy trajectory of change, and this has in a way rendered our he called them liberators, who have very slowly but steadily turned into oppressors. It has made them very paranoid, and this has caused them to act in different ways. Our meeting and our constant communication to us is not only to keep us, to keep our voice there, but actually the voice of fellow leaders from the wider Africa are voices of life. They are life-saving voices, well knowing that having put our media in the pocket back home, it is the media and the voices of our fellow Africans, especially from respected nations like South Africa, that count so much. So for us, it is not only connecting as brothers, as Africans, but it is life-saving for us. And that brings me, the same situation brings me to the situation of women. While our generation is automatically interconnected, we live in a generation that has women uplifted, at least psychologically and mentally. We, as a People Power movement in Uganda, hold very highly the involvement and importance of women, well knowing that we have women leaders that are super intelligent. It is clear that the majority of our citizens in Uganda are women, and yes, like my brother put it, they of all the challenges. The first recipient of the pain of poverty is a woman. The poor service delivery is with women. In Uganda, unlike very many parts of Africa, we lose 19 women every day giving birth. And besides only that, the repression of the government has come to a level where women are mainly targeted. They are beaten, they are raped to break their spirit. We have one of East Africa's, if not Africa's most celebrated academics, Dr. Stella Nyanzi, who is serving an 18-month charge for writing a poem against the president. So the crackdown has been in a great way to the women. However, it has also challenged them to rise up, because like never before in Uganda and in a greater part of East Africa, we've seen a rise of women, which we believe in. And I personally believe in so much, because I'm a mother's son. I'm a product of a woman, something that I've been so proud of. So it is something that we look at not only as the People Power movement in Uganda, but the whole Africa. We encourage it because we know our female counterparts are just as important, in fact more important, because they are more in numbers than us.
Two more questions to you from that. The first one, I mean, it's the elections are only in 1.5 years, or almost 2 years. Didn't you start too early? I mean, the whole might of the government and of the security forces will just kind of pounce on you. Wouldn't it have been better to keep kind of quiet and get the right timing so that they can't really flatten you altogether? And the second question is that I'm old enough to be able to judge that 35 years ago your enemy or Mr. Museveni would have sat here and would have said there's a new generation of leaders. I'm kind of representing the democratic and against the dictatorship and so on. How do you make sure that we won't sit here in 35 years and somebody will talk about you and being the dictator?
Thank you. Thank you very much. The first question is an interesting one. Couldn't we wait? First of all, I come into the politics of Uganda not as a politician, but as one of the citizens. I'm an artist who's so concerned about how my people are being governed, and it started more like a sensitization or a public awakening. And we initially had actually thought that it would take us much longer for us to...
All right, so we're going to leave that for the time being. That's Mmusi Maimane, former opposition leader here in South Africa, with another activist and one seeking political office in Uganda, Bobi Wine. He's a musician who's turned politician, and sharing their thoughts about opposition politics across the continent, both saying that it may be that their struggles are slightly different, but the values that they're both fighting for on the continent are the same, and that it's to make sure that liberators who've turned oppressors do not continue to dictate and steal the future that the majority of Africans want for the future. Both were talking about the role of women in opposition politics, and Mmusi says that we need to work better together, better coordinated, more funds needed to be addressing these issues, better coordination, and that we need to support each other across borders. Bobi Wine talked about that as well, and talked about the issues that women are facing in his own country, Uganda. He noted that 19 women are dying every single day just giving birth, and that others are being targeted just for their political standings to try and frustrate them. Giving an example of a woman, a professor who was jailed for writing a poem against the Ugandan president. So they're talking about this future of the continent, and the need for opposition politics to be better coordinated across borders, giving each other an important voice. And Bobi Wine said that the media outside of Uganda, in writing the stories of the people in Uganda, are saving lives. All right, we'll leave that for the time